We're on the final step of the legislative process. And as you can imagine, when a bill from one chamber manages to pass through the opposite chamber, they often get amended in the process. This is particularly true for controversial or complex bills. These differences must be addressed and reconciled before the bill is eligible for the governor's signature.
There are a lot of twists and turns in the legislative process.
At the end of the day, what the goal is to have a piece of legislation come out of both chambers in identical form so that it can be sent on to the governor to be signed.
But that piece about when it's different is a little bit more complex. Sometimes the opposite chamber will make changes to the bill in the form of amendments. When that happens, it's got to come back to the original chamber, and that original chamber has some choices to make. They can either concur with those changes.
Okay, we're going to concur. We didn't do that on our side, but we're going to go ahead and concur and accept that, and boom, we're going to pass it. And now that bill goes on to the governor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The other body made some amendments that I think are absolutely acceptable, and I urge concurrence on this bill. Please vote yes.
Or if they disagree with the changes, they have two different choices. They can do a dispute and send it back to the opposite house.
A message from the Senate. Clerk will read.
Mr. Speaker, the Senate refuses to concur in the House amendments to engross substitute Senate bill.
And have them reconsider those amendments they have made.
So there's a couple of actions you can take. You can demand that the other chamber recede from it.
With the consent of the House will recede from its amendment to Senate Bill 55.
Or they insist that we concur.
I move that the House insist on its position regarding the amendments to engross substitute Senate Bill 5041 and ask the Senate to concur therein.
And you'll have that dispute going back and forth saying, well, we want you to proceed. And the other chamber says, no, we insist that you concur with us. And that's how sometimes these legislative pieces will die in the end because we run out of clock.
To avoid disputing back and forth, which could eat up precious time, members from both chambers will come together into a conference committee to work out the differences in the two versions of legislation.
Now that the House has not concurred in the Senate amendments to engross House Bill 1217, if there is no objection, the House asks the Senate for a conference on its amendments to engross House Bill 1217.
Conference committees are a really important step, particularly for really complex legislation. You know, the concurrence and dispute process is a pretty simple process if you have very simple changes, but when there are significant policy differences between the House and the Senate on complex legislation, the conference committee is the right approach to work out those differences.
It's not used as often as the other motions. Oftentimes these things get resolved well before having to get to that step. So, but if you can't arrive at a solution, the conference is the necessary step to take to hopefully salvage a piece of policy that you feel strongly about and be able to get something through both chambers. It's kind of like that final tool that can be used, and so it's a good thing from that standpoint. I don't like the lack of transparency with it and the inability then to be able to make any further changes.
The House and the Senate assign 2 members from the majority party and 1 from the minority party for a total of 6 members who will negotiate the final bill that will be presented to each chamber for an up or a down vote. No further amendments are allowed. In 2025, Democrats have legislative control of both chambers and thus have a majority of seats at the table.
So it's possible a bill can come out of conference very different than what it did originally, and that's one of the risks that can happen with a conference report because you do have that lack of transparency and not the public input, and when the public doesn't get to have that input, sometimes things get missed, and so that is one of the dangers in a conference.
The conference committee process is typically designed to work out final key differences between the bills. It may not be the exact version of the bill that either the House or the Senate voted for. It's often a compromise between the 2 chambers and between the 2 parties. With the exception of the budget, which is just really complex, you are not typically renegotiating pieces that have already been agreed to by both the House and the Senate. You're typically really focused on what are the key differences.
You know, being in the minority, you recognize that we're at the end of the day, we're not going to win the vote that we want, but the power of the minority is making sure your voice is heard, and you can sometimes have persuasion in a given piece of legislation, and I think if the majority party is willing to listen and understand what the impacts are for any piece of policy, we can have, and we do often have, an impact on that final piece.
So when we do a conference committee, we appoint our most passionate advocate, the prime sponsor of the legislation, and also our chair and ranking member of the Committee of Jurisdiction that has that policy expertise. And so in many respects, by the time something comes back for an up or down vote, I have a degree of confidence that the experts in the room, the most passionate advocates, have worked through those changes and they've brought something back to us that is something that can pass the legislature. And so I typically feel pretty good about that process. I've had certainly cases where I vehemently disagreed with the outcome, and that's why I have a no vote at my disposal.